Chapter 8. Sweat ran down Derek's face, despite the constant chill, even sheltered and underground. He looked at the fighter opposite him, Michelle, the only other woman alive in their group now, besides Allison, and nodded to her. On 3, 1, 2, 3. The pair of them grunted and heaved together as they lifted the heavy, water-filled barrel up and maneuvered it on top of the pile, placing it over a pair of wooden fitting that had been carved to accommodate the barrel's curves and keep them in place. After several seconds of straining, they got it on top and let go, both simultaneously breathing out in relief. Honestly, Reese, why'd you ask me to lift it? Why not one of the guys? Equal opportunities. Derek shrugged and picked up his canteen mug. He placed it under the small tap in the barrel and turned it on, releasing a thin stream of water that took several long seconds to fill the vessel. He drank it all down in one gulp. You saying you can't keep up with the boys, Michelle? He asked teasingly. More like you can't keep up with me. She rolled her eyes and left to attend to her few meager belongings. Derek turned away and headed to the small office he'd chosen as his own quarters, following Michelle's example. He closed the door after he slipped in and sat down on the chair in front of the desk. An old desktop computer with a flat screen sat atop it, little more than an ungainly paperweight, with no power to run the thing. The only reason it was still there was because Derek hadn't gotten around to moving it yet. They had to be careful where they tossed their trash out. Any discarded items sticking out of place could easily signal to a machine that happened to be patrolling that there were people nearby. And the last thing they wanted was to be discovered, especially so soon after they'd already lost their home and half their friends. They'd found a new home under East LA. Having left the sewer network and scoured the metro rail, they'd found a station that looked like it hadn't been touched since the bombs had fallen, and the recon patrol had reported it clear and safe enough to use. It had taken days to haul all their surviving equipment and supplies the 7 miles from their old base to the metro station, and they'd only just finished the final supply run. Now they were just about settled in, and they could try and get back to some kind of normal routine. The regular status reports from Kyle and his team seemed promising. They were closing the gap on John Connor, and it was only a matter of time until they caught him. Derek had deliberately declined to tell Kyle and Allison where their new base was. He felt like a complete shit for lying to his brother, or any of them, since they were all family, but it had to be done. Hunting down a Gray was a high-risk operation, and there was a chance they could be captured. He wasn't going to give them their location, in case it was tortured out of them. After the machine that had impersonated Thomas and slaughtered half his group, and after John had found them so easily, he wasn't going to take any more chances. He'd thought long and hard about his need to have John brought back. He'd heard the others muttering, saying he was getting obsessed, but they didn't know. They didn't see the bigger picture. Not only did John have to answer to what he'd done to them all, but as a Gray, he'd have some important information they could use to their advantage. They couldn't beat Skynet. Derek had no illusions about that. Nobody was going to rise from the ashes and defeat the machines. All they could do was hope to survive and stay hidden. Connor might know a few things, or a few places even where they could go. All they could hope for was to survive, but that didn't mean they had to do so in complete squalor underneath the ruins of LA. Derek reckoned there had to be safe havens out there somewhere. National parks, forests in the north, maybe even somewhere in the Yukon. Places so remote that Skynet wouldn't even bother sending machines to patrol, and they could live their lives without the constant threat of machines hanging over them. He wanted to know where Skynet's machines didn't go and how to get there. Mac to Reese, come in. Derek almost jumped out of his chair in shock as his radio crackled to life. Mac was sweeping the area to search for food and wasn't due until the sun started to rise hours away. He grabbed it and pressed down hard on the comm button. I hear you, Mac, he replied. What's up? Something's going on up here. You'd better take a look at it. Something bad? Derek asked. Something interesting, Mac's voice crackled. I'll be there in 10. Derek put down the radio and got up. He opened the storage closet where he stowed his things and put on the combat vest he'd scavenged from an old battle site years ago, made sure he had spare magazines, grenades, and put his radio in one of the pouches, then put on his thick, heavy coat over it and put his head through the sling of his plasma rifle. He stepped out of his quarters and called out to Michelle. I'm meeting Mac up top. You're in charge, he told her. He ran up the several flights of stairs that led to the surface, using his flashlight to guide him, and emerged inside the collapsed ruins of the station entrance, immersed in complete darkness. He ran the beam all over the inside of the decimated structure until he saw what he was looking for, a sheet of corrugated iron covering a gap between the stumps of 2 concrete pillars. He pulled the iron sheet away and stepped outside into open, immediately feeling the bitter, icy cold wind slap him in the face. He quickly placed it back over the hole, concealing the entrance, and quick marched away from the flattened building, wanting to put distance between himself and it. If machines found him away from it, they wouldn't be able to link him to the station and wouldn't send a patrol there. Not before they tortured the information out of him, and Derek liked to think that he could withstand whatever nasty, brutal things the machines would do. He hoped he'd never have to find out otherwise. Something exploded in the distance, a bright orange flash that momentarily lit the night up before rapidly dying down, followed a split second later by a loud boom that shook the ground slightly. What the hell's that? Derek wondered. Another flash of sparks erupted in the sky, and an HK fell out of the air and smashed into the ground, exploding brilliantly as fuel and plasma stores went up in a roiling blue-white flame and thick cloud of smoke. That's what I wanted to show you, Reese. Derek looked all over, but couldn't see Mac until he emerged from behind the remnants of a wall. Derek went over to him and saw Mac and another man, Simmons, crouched down behind the crumbling brickwork and looking out binoculars and thermal imaging goggles, respectively. What is it? Derek asked. 3 more HKs and a Centaur got the good news in the last half hour. Mac handed the thermal imaging goggles to Derek and pointed to a spot in the distance. Derek peered through them and followed Mac's finger to a wide stretch of road 1/2 mile straight down from where they were. Derek made out the broken tracks of a Centaur, but that was all that was left of the thing. Pieces of it lay all around. A second sight showed the shattered wreck of a HK, shot out of the sky and scattered in pieces on the ground, still smoldering. Derek looked out to the far right, and in the distance, could see a Skynet communications and sensor array stood out in the middle of what used to be a park, about a mile or so away. It was the size of a small warehouse and was covered in antennae and satellite dishes. It was one facility of several in LA alone, and was used to maintain constant communication between Skynet's machines. The place was extremely well guarded, Derek knew. Endos patrolled the area regularly, as did Centaurs, and HKs were never far away. The ground around it was laced with mines in case anyone did manage to sneak through the perimeter without being spotted by the machines. Here it comes, Mac said. Keep looking and listen carefully. Derek strained his ears, trying to pick out a sound that meant something. Eventually, he heard it, a low whistle in the air above. A split second later, the whole place flared up in a terrific explosion, shaking the ground once again as a giant fireball erupted outwards. What the hell is that? Derek asked as he pulled the image intensifiers from his face, incredulous. That's too big to be a rocket, Simmons said. Gotta be an airstrike, right, or artillery. Not artillery, Mac replied. Artillery doesn't blow HKs out of the sky or smash Centaurs, flat, with that kind of accuracy. Whatever's doing that's in the air. But there hasn't been an Air Force in about 15 years, Simmons protested. Can't be Air Force. No way is Skynet tearing up its own. Derek thought about that for a moment before a light bulb went off in his head. We've got a new player in town, he commented. Though who they were, he had no idea. That's gotta be good, right? Simmons asked. Someone out there with firepower, air power, giving it back to Skynet. Depends, Mac replied grimly. Derek nodded in agreement. I hope so, Derek said as he looked around and spotted more flashes in the distance. Whoever it was, they were really giving the machines a hammering tonight. He hadn't seen so many tin cans blown up since before Bedell bought the farm. It didn't necessarily mean it was good news for them, though. Let's just hope that it lasts. In Derek's experience, there'd been a lot of groups that had seemed powerful, promised to wipe Skynet and the machines away, and they'd all failed. Whoever these new guys were, bombing the hell out of Skynet, he didn't hold out much hope for them either. John Henry and Cameron sat in front of the screens in the control room, simultaneously feeding data to the machines that were airborne as well as analyzing footage and images they and the other UCAVs had captured during their sorties and transmitted back to them. Cameron was still angry that Weaver had taken John away. She didn't say anything to him, but he could sense the tension between her and Catherine Weaver. She'd have attacked Weaver to keep John safe, even though the odds of her winning were infinitesimal. He knew she'd sacrifice herself without hesitation for John Connor. It interested him. Though there were more pressing concerns to deal with, and both of them knew that. Cameron's anger was reduced to the background as much as she could, as they concentrated on their tasks. One of the computer screens displayed a still black and white image of a structure, from a bird's eye view. Outside, it was open ground with what John Henry identified to be a small number of HKs lined up in rows. It's an HK factory, Cameron told him. She recognized the structure, even though she'd never seen one from above before. We should destroy it. No, John Henry disagreed with her. Miss Weaver, he called out. Seconds later, Weaver appeared from the hangar proper, where she'd been seeing to the maintenance of the UCAVs. Being able to form any solid metal shape had been an advantage for her when making mechanical repairs. Forming her arms into wrenches, screwdrivers, and other assorted tools had made Weaver the perfect engineer as well as the perfect killing machine. Skynet had unknowingly outdone itself when it created the liquid metal series Terminators. Yes, she asked him. We've located an HK factory in Burbank. Yes. Cameron's knowledge of Skynet and her combat experience is very helpful. To John Henry, Cameron was a valuable ally and a friend. Weaver ignored his statement. Cameron was unimportant to her plans. Her knowledge was useful, but she had similar files to Cameron. She could have given John Henry the information he needed without adversely influencing him, as Cameron was. Are you going to destroy it? She asked. John Henry wasn't surprised at Weaver's question. Both she and Cameron were Terminators. Destruction of the enemy was inherent in their design. I want to capture it, he said. Capturing a facility like that will take more resources than we have, Weaver told him. We don't have any ground assets to engage the factory. She herself could defeat any defenses both on the outside and the inside, but she couldn't be in two places at once. If she left to capture the factory, she couldn't protect John Henry. He'd be alone and vulnerable to Cameron's influence, as well as any roving Skynet patrols. Our current stocks of fuel and munitions will be expended within 2 weeks at the current rate of sorties, he explained. These aircraft have many advantages over Skynet's HKs in air-to-air combat, but their main weakness is their reliance on fossil fuels and missiles that aren't in production. What are you suggesting? Weaver asked. Cameron was interested, too. If we capture the factory intact, we can redesign HKs with better air-to-air capabilities and build large numbers of them to use against Skynet. We should capture an endo factory, too, Cameron told him. She was impressed with his plan. It was similar to Future John's strategy of reprogramming Terminators to fight for the resistance, but on a larger scale. Whilst John Henry formulated his plan, Cameron focused her attention on the UCAV she'd assigned to fly cover over John's location. There were no machines currently near him. The aircraft was armed with a pair of AMRAAM missiles and a pair of laser-guided bombs, enabling it to destroy any threats to John, either from HKs or Centaur tanks. Her main concern was attack from Terminators or Endos. She couldn't protect him from those with an aircraft, especially if they were in a close engagement. "It's a good plan, but it's impossible for now," Weaver told him. "We don't have the resources to capture and defend the factory. You should focus your attention on eliminating threats to this facility first." Weaver turned and left the control room to continue her maintenance of the UCAVs, a very demanding task for any one individual, even one of her unique capabilities. "There are no threats to this facility," Cameron disagreed. "We're in the desert, and we can detect anything approaching. Miss Weaver is very protective. You said that yourself. Perhaps she doesn't wish to leave us alone and vulnerable. Or she's trying to control you," Cameron suggested. She'd seen it happen to John before. Riley had tried to control John and turn him against her. Sarah had thought she herself had been trying to control John. Cameron suspected Catherine Weaver had motives she was hiding from them. John lowered the barrel of his M14 to the ground and let Ellison and Savannah pick up their weapons. Ellison stepped forward as Savannah placed her small arsenal back on her person. "We've been waiting a long time, John." He looked at his younger opposite in wonder. Ellison knew he'd aged. 18 years of getting older. Surviving and looking after Savannah, who'd proven to be a handful as she'd grown up, had taken its toll on him. "It's weird," he continued. 18 years of waiting, and I didn't once think of what I'd say to you when we found you." "Hey," Savannah interjected as she finished strapping her weapons to herself. "How about we get out of here first before Metal shows up?" "She's right," Ellison said to John. "We have to move." "Follow me," John told them. He turned round and went straight towards the house he'd been in just minutes ago. As if to confirm Savannah's statement, a faint rumbling of tracks could be heard in the distance. "Centaur tank," John said to himself. He led them to the garage and pulled the door open, ushering them inside before he pulled it closed behind them once more. Savannah flicked on a flashlight and shone a beam throughout the inside of the garage, sweeping it over the Jeep Cherokee and the walls behind it. The trio walked through the garage, and Ellison ran his hand over the Jeep's hood, noticing how warm it still was. "This your car?" he asked. No wonder he'd been able to get away so fast if he'd found a vehicle already. "Weaver gave it to me," John replied. Savannah spat on the floor in disgust, and through the light cast by the flashlight's beam he could see fierce, burning anger in her eyes. "Okay." He looked at her, wondering what was going on in her head. This clearly wasn't the same sweet little girl he'd met in Dr. Sherman's office. The three of them entered the house proper, and John led them up the creaky staircase to the bedroom he'd stashed his few items. Ellison sat down on the double bed with a sigh of relief and lay back on the dusty mattress. He hadn't been on a proper bed in years. He was practically in heaven already. Savannah stood to one side of the window and kept watch, stood sentinel almost like a Terminator, John noted. Apart from her steady breathing, she barely moved an inch. Suddenly, she shrugged off her pack, her webbing, heavy coat, and pulled off her hat, dumping them on the ground, then reattached the belt kit around her waist and picked up her rifle. John saw under the coat she had definitely grown up from the little girl he'd met. She'd be very attractive if she made half an effort, though he doubted many people really cared much for their appearance in this day and age, what with more important things to worry about. Thinking of Savannah like that, even for a split second, stirred up thoughts of Cameron. She'd always been stunning even without trying, without a moment's thought for her appearance other than how to blend in wherever she was going. It was funny, he thought, how seeing another woman made him instantly think of Cameron. Savannah turned to them, a hard look in her eyes. "It's nearly dawn, so we should stay here. I'll take first watch." She picked up her rifle once more and headed downstairs, without another word. John watched her go, confused. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked. Ellison shook his head sadly. "It's just how she is." He looked out of the window and watched as the in-sky blackness started to slowly fade into a dark gray over the horizon, and the very tip of the sun rose above the fractured skyline, the beginnings of a dull red orb that started to cast a blood-red hue over the distant landscape. "First light," Ellison commented. "It'll be dawn in less than an hour. We're stuck here for the day. When it gets dark, we'll move out." "Move to where?" John asked. "You'll see." Ellison took off his heavy brown overcoat and unclipped his webbing, then slung his rifle back over his shoulder and moved to the door. "Does this house have a shed in the back?" "I don't know," John answered. He hadn't taken much notice when he'd briefly been in the backyard. He followed after Ellison and descended the staircase. There was no sign of Savannah, but John saw that Ellison didn't seem worried. She was probably in the living room or something. John and Ellison walked through the kitchen at the back of the house and opened the back door. "Should be safe enough in the yard," Ellison said. "HK would have to fly right over here to see us." In the backyard, sure enough, was a garden shed. It looked dilapidated to John, but then again he thought, what wasn't any more? The pair of them took a quick look skywards, out of caution and force of habit. They strode towards it, and John saw how right he was about the state of the shed. It was constructed of wooden panels that had partially rotted through in several places and turned green with mold in others. Holding the door shut was a simple padlock over a latch. John took out his knife and jammed it into the weak wooden wall just next to the latch, then sawed the serrated edge through the half-rotten plank. He yanked hard on the latch until it broke free from the shed. Then he pulled the door open with ease, wincing as the rusty hinges creaked. He just had to hope there were no machines nearby to hear it. They stepped inside, and John switched on his small flashlight, sweeping it over the interior of the shed. "What are we looking for?" he asked. Ellison stepped up to one of the walls and switched on his own light, shining it on a selection of garden tools hung up on hooks. Ellison selected 2 shovels and pulled them off the wall. "These will do," he replied simply. "Do for what?" John asked as they left the shed and headed back into the house. He was seriously confused. Movement caught his attention as they entered the kitchen, and he saw Savannah emerging from the living room. She leaned against the doorway, her rifle held in one arm and pointed at the ground. It was time to level with Ellison and Savannah, he thought, and tell them the score. Weaver's got Cameron and John Henry. John once again noticed the look on Savannah's face at the very mention of Weaver. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pursed, and he noticed her jaw set. "I tried to get Cameron back, but Weaver won't give her up unless I get another chip for John Henry. I'm gonna need your help to get one." Ellison and Savannah shared a knowing look and nodded at each other. "We can do a bit more than that," Savannah said to him. John saw they knew something they weren't letting on, but for the life of him, he couldn't figure out what it was. Ellison opened his mouth and started to say something, but Savannah stopped him, a small, sly smile spreading on her lips. "It'll be a surprise," she told him. "You'll find out tonight." Allison and Kyle ran through the city with Mason and Briggs, the former pair right behind Cassie, as the German shepherd followed a scent. They'd followed John's scent to the HK crash site and had gone through the residential area, where Cassie had led them further east towards the outskirts of LA. The first rays of the sun were shining through the thick clouds of ash and dust high in the atmosphere, casting the sky crimson over the residential area of East LA. "Guys, stop," Kyle called out, pausing where he was and breathing deeply to catch his breath. He hadn't ran so far in ages, and his whole body ached. The others slowed down to a standstill, and Allison called Cassie back to her, the dog instantly abandoning its trail and returning to her mistress's side, panting profusely as were her human companions. "What's up?" Mason asked. "The sun's up," Kyle said. "We can't follow anymore. We have to find somewhere to lay up for the day." Kyle saw the look of dismay on Allison's face as she huffed in annoyance. "We're onto him," she protested. "If we lay up now, Cassie will lose his scent. We might never find him again. And if we don't lay up, the machines will kill us, and we'll still never find him." But Kyle stepped up close to her and grasped her shoulders. Not roughly, but firmly, as he looked into her eyes. "No buts, Allison. We've lost enough friends already. We're not losing any more by being reckless." She looked up at him and nodded, though he could tell from her face she was reluctant to stop. "We're gonna catch John, I promise. But we need to be smart about it. He's not alone anymore. We saw that at the crash site. He's got at least 2 others with him, probably Terminators. We can't afford to just run blindly into him, or we'll get ourselves killed." "Okay," she said, still reluctant. "Good. Let's find somewhere to hunker down for the day," he told them. It wasn't hard. The residential area was still in reasonable shape, and there were plenty of houses to choose from. They set up in one house, and after sweeping it clear of machines or other people, laid their roll mats and sleeping bags out on the floor of the living room. Briggs took out a small field cooker and set it up on the floor. He lit it up as Kyle and Mason took out their mess tins and poured water from their canteens into them. Kyle took out a foil wrapper from his pack and opened it, revealing reddish-brown chunks of dried meat. He tore a strip off and started to eat it. His stomach growled gratefully for the small amount of food. Mason and Briggs dug food from their own packs and started to eat as they waited for their water to heat up. Boiling the water served the dual purpose of killing any nasty bugs, as well as giving them something hot to drink. "I'll take first watch," Allison said. She left the others and headed up the stairs with Cassie. She entered what had once been a children's bedroom and sat on one of the single beds against the front window. She set her pack down and placed her assault rifle on the bed next to her. Cassie jumped up onto the bed and nuzzled into Allison's chest. "Good girl." She hugged the dog into her and stroked the top of her head and her back, causing Cassie to roll onto her back on Allison's lap. She smiled down at her 4-legged companion and rubbed Cassie's belly and chest. She looked down at Cassie and then out the window. Somewhere out there, not too far away, were John Connor and his accomplices. Kyle was right. He'd met up with 2 other people, as far as they could tell from the footprints left behind. One a man and the other a woman, judging from the size of one pair of prints. "You're out there, you bastard," she muttered under her breath, still rubbing Cassie's belly unconsciously. "We'll find you." John, Ellison, and Savannah marched silently through the outskirts of Los Angeles. All 3 had their weapons shouldered, and their eyes and ears open for any signs of machines nearby. John breathed out and saw a puff of steam emerge as his warm breath met the freezing air. He didn't see any such steam coming from Savannah in front of him, and resolved to breathe through his nose like she was. He didn't know if the warm air from their breath could give them away or not, but he figured she wasn't taking any chances. He looked at Savannah as she steadily marched forward in front of him, and found himself more and more intrigued by her. Apart from the red hair, and the freckles she had nothing in common with the Savannah he'd met before. He wanted to talk to her, find out more about her, but it was too dangerous whilst they were on the move, and she didn't seem very talkative anyway, from what he'd seen. They marched down a road that ran by a cemetery right at the city's limits, still in silence. It was the same place they'd buried Derek's ashes, John noted, except the rolling green hills were a muddy brown where the grass had died and rotted away a long time ago. Savannah paused and shot out her fist to the side of her head. John saw the motion and stopped dead, followed by Ellison behind him. "Centaur," she whispered harshly, though John couldn't hear anything. Savannah pointed ahead, and then at the wall of the cemetery. A moment later, she dashed across the road, faster than John expected her to, and jumped at the cemetery wall, hauling herself up over the 8-foot wall and flattening herself against the top as she swung over and disappeared from view. "Come on," Ellison whispered and followed after her. John heard the low rumbling of tracks in the distance ahead and didn't hesitate to run after Ellison. The older man leaned against the wall and crouched down, linking his hands together in front of his groin. John nodded in understanding and stepped on the palms of Ellison's interlaced hands. The former agent straightened his knees and stood straight, lifting John up so he could reach the top of the wall. John swung one leg over the wall, looked over to see Savannah waiting below, and reached down to pull Ellison up. He was surprised at how spry Ellison was for a man of 60 or so. Both John and Ellison dropped down behind the wall and lay down flat against it, concealed in the darkness from view. The rumbling of tracks got louder, accompanied by a metallic squeaking of metal on metal as the centaur got closer. Even behind the wall, John didn't dare move. The three of them waited, remaining statues still, but preparing to run should the mammoth patrol machine open fire at them. John looked out towards the cemetery and saw HKs flying out in the distance, perhaps a mile or two away, and casting their search beams over East LA. He hoped and prayed to whatever deities were out there that none of them flew in their direction. The centaur rolled by the cemetery wall and continued down the road. Its tracks chewed up the asphalt and tarmac under the tremendous weight of the machine. John waited for the sound to fade to almost nothing before he started to pull himself up. Savannah shot her hand out again and grabbed John, pulling him to the ground beside her. She crawled on top of him and flattened herself on his stomach. "What?" Savannah clamped her hand down over his mouth and pressed her forehead into his, so even in the darkness he could see the intense glare she was shooting at him. "SHHH," she pointed to a small hole in the wall, a few inches above the ground and barely the size of John's fist. He turned his head towards it and watched, trying to ignore the fact Savannah was still lying on top of him with her hand pressed to his mouth. He watched and waited, wondering what the hell she was doing. After a couple of minutes, John heard more sounds. Metal clipping on the ground repeatedly, regularly. Footsteps, he realized. Through the hole, he saw machines marching on the far side of the road, or their legs at least. Endos, patrolling in the same direction the centaur had traveled. Savannah lay still on top of John, not moving an inch. After what John figured must have been several minutes, Savannah rolled off of John, stood up and held her hand down to him. She pulled him up to his feet and made sure he was looking at her. "Always wait after a centaur passes by," she warned him. "Endos are never far behind." She turned away from John and marched towards the rows of headstones. How the hell is this stupid kid meant to save us all? She wondered. He clearly had some survival skills, but it wasn't enough. Either John Connor had some other talents they hadn't seen yet, or Ellison had severely exaggerated the kid's importance. Either way, she wasn't finding herself particularly overwhelmed by John so far. She led the way through rows upon rows of graves, treading carefully and making sure she didn't step on anything that would make a sound or alert anyone or anything out there to their presence. "What are we doing here?" John asked quietly. "You'll see," Ellison simply said. They headed for another section of the cemetery, far from the road they'd entered from, and to John, the place felt even more massive at night. Eventually, Savannah stopped at a grave halfway down a gently rolling hill. John stepped in front of it and saw the name etched onto it, Amelia Kearns. "Who's that?" John asked as Ellison unclipped his pack, dropping the shovels he'd taken from the shed to the ground. "It's a name I'd remember," Ellison explained, "one that couldn't be traced to you or your mother." He tossed a shovel to John. "Start digging," he said. Savannah knelt down on one knee and kept watch as John and Ellison started to dig into the ground. John had no idea why the hell they were at a cemetery, digging graves. The whole thing just felt so wrong and creepy as hell. It took a while, but after an eternity of digging and sweating and grunting, they'd made it down several feet and were standing over a heavy wooden coffin. Ellison ushered John to the side, pushing him away from the coffin while he crouched down, took out his knife and jammed it under the lid. "What are you doing?" John asked, incredulous. Ellison moved the knife back and forth, up and down, and slid his fingers underneath the lid. "This is just wrong," John shook his head. He wouldn't have thought the pair of them were into grave robbing, but that's exactly what this looked like. Why the hell had they brought him here? Ellison grunted and heaved, pulling the lid up until the nails worked loose and he flipped it up. Dust erupted all over them, and John resisted the urge to cough in case anything out there was listening. John peered inside as the dust settled, and his eyes widened in complete disbelief at the sight of the body below, perfectly preserved, as if she were only asleep. "Cameron!" John's mouth opened in utter confusion as he gawped at the still, peacefully inert form of his protector, laid on her back with her eyes closed and her hands resting on her chest. He reached down and grasped one of her petite hands in his, stroking his thumb over the smooth skin, unblemished. She felt cold to touch, almost like a corpse from being buried beneath the ground for so long, he supposed. What amazed him was her face. When he'd last seen her, she'd been missing an eye and half her face had been blasted away by gunfire, but now it was as if she'd never been shot in the first place. Somehow she'd either been repaired or the skin had healed. John reached out with one hand and opened up her eyelids, revealing an intact, white and chocolate-brown orb. He'd been so worried he'd never see her again, that he'd spend the rest of his life searching through this post-apocalyptic world for her. Seeing her now, in one piece, lifted a huge weight off his shoulders, though not all of it. He still needed her chip. "At least I'm one step closer." As John lifted her hand up, he saw the glint of something underneath her. He reached under and felt the familiar cold round metal of a gun barrel. "Here!" Ellison grabbed Cameron's arms and pulled her body up and out of the coffin, hoisting her up onto the ground above, at Savannah's feet. She looked down at Cameron, then at John. "Can't believe you came through time for a tin can." She snorted, then turned back to watching out for any movement. John looked down at the coffin Cameron once occupied and shined his flashlight down into it. Buried with Cameron was a small arsenal. HK 417 battle rifle, AK-47s, pistols, grenade launchers, even a full belt-fed machine gun. Ellison reached down and handed the HK 417 to John. "These are for you," he said. He handed John boxes of ammunition with half a dozen empty magazines. John immediately and almost unconsciously opened the box and started to load rounds into the magazines. "They're presents from your mother," Ellison finished. John looked up at Ellison as he mentioned his mom. He'd been ashamed to say that he'd been so busy struggling to survive that he'd hardly thought of her at all. John looked down at the armory below, then back up to the former agent. "Ellison, what happened to my mom?" Thunder growled loudly in the dark gray, stormy clouds that loomed over Los Angeles. It crackled and smashed, and lightning cut through the air violently, illuminating the darkening sky for the briefest of flashes as it struck like an angry god, threatening its creations below. The heavens opened up and poured down on the city, so heavy it was practically a monsoon. A lone vehicle stood with the lights off in an alleyway in a broken, run-down part of the city. Its windscreen wipers were set to max, rapidly swiping left to right and back, but were barely able to keep the glass clear for more than a second before it was saturated with heavy, fat raindrops once more. 2 occupants sat inside, tired, bored, and nervous. The power had been restored in LA, making it much harder for them to slip by unnoticed. "I don't think he's going to show," Sarah said, tilting her head back on the headrest. "Give it some time," Ellison replied calmly. "We've been here for 3 hours," said Sarah. "Malenkov played us. It happens. We should go." Ellison shook his head and took another bite of the double cheeseburger he'd bought just before they'd parked up for their meet with Malenkov's men. It was 3.5 hours cold, but it was energy-rich food, and just the act of eating something helped stave off the boredom for a few seconds. "You've never been on a stakeout, then?" He turned to her after he'd swallowed the mouthful of burger. "I've had to wait a lot longer than this." "Don't worry, I know Malenkov. He'll show." "That's something else." Sarah met his look with a doubtful one of her own. "How do we know he's not setting us up?" "He'd have a lot to gain by selling us out to the feds." "He'd have more to lose," Ellison said. He took another mouthful of his burger, then sucked down some soda from his extra-large drink. One thing he'd learnt early on in the FBI: you never ate healthy during a stakeout or if waiting for a contact. Fast food was the standard issue for covert surveillance. He finished off his drink, careful not to slurp the last of it. He knew from experience that some people were very irritable when cooped up in a car or a room for a long time, and the smallest things like slurping a drink or smacking your lips when you ate could grate on their nerves. Ellison didn't doubt for a second that Sarah was one of those people who didn't like keeping still for long. "Malenkov's position relies on a lot of trust," he finally continued. "If word got around that he'd sold out a client to the FBI, if they knew he was in touch with the Bureau at all, there'd be a contract on his head before you could blink. It's why the FBI only asks him for information on any customers who'd pose a threat to national security." "In their eyes, that's us," Sarah countered. "Just give it some time," Ellison said. They waited and waited, and the rain poured down even harder, like a monsoon. It came down so hard and so thick that they could barely make out anything past a few meters. It would be perfect for them to go unnoticed, Sarah thought, but that also applied to anyone else following them. Sarah looked out of the windscreen and her window, straining her eyes to spot any signs of movement in the distance, searching for a SWAT team, covert surveillance, or even a lone assassin. She couldn't see anyone outside, but that didn't mean they weren't there. A Terminator could easily have eyes on them from further away, whilst staying out of sight. She wouldn't have thought a 888 would be conducting surveillance on them, but then again, she'd once thought a machine would never protect, or do such mundane jobs as collecting refined coltan. There was so much she didn't know. She felt like she was at a constant disadvantage. Something moved down the alleyway, and both Sarah and Ellison shot up, alert and eyes forward in unison. Sarah reached down instinctively for her pistol, but Ellison put his hand on her arm to hold her steady. Through the rain emerged the shape of a van, slowly inching its way towards them. It stopped 20 feet from them, and its lights flashed on once, bathing them in light for a brief moment. They flicked on again, twice in rapid succession. "That's the signal." Ellison, he opened door and stepped out. Sarah exited from her side a moment later. "Wish they'd parked closer," he said as the rain instantly saturated his suit and shirt. Sarah quickly became equally as soaked, but she didn't complain. After years in South America, Where they had monsoons every day like clockwork, the rain didn't bother her. Together they stepped towards the van. Sarah's pistol was in her hand, not willing to take any chances. Two men stepped out of the vehicle, both large, leather-clad men with hard faces and harder eyes. The look of men who'd have about as few issues killing them as a Terminator would. "You have the merchandise?" Sarah asked. "Da," one of the men replied, his Eastern European accent thick and heavy. "You have the money." She noticed both of them carried pistols in their hands. Ellison held up a large brown paper envelope for them to see. 15,000, he said. The rest of the $45,000 payment they'd agreed with Malenkov. "Come," one of them said. Sarah moved forward but signaled for Ellison to stay back. She still didn't trust these guys, and she wouldn't until they had the weapons they'd come for in their car, and they were gone. One of the men opened the van's rear doors and turned a light on in the back. He pulled back a tarp to reveal the array of weapons she'd selected. Sarah glanced across the small arsenal, making sure everything they'd asked for was there. Unexpectedly, it was all present. There were two extraneous items also placed behind the long shapes of the machine gun and the rocket launcher. She recognized them, of course, two sets of body armor. The first leather-clad heavy saw what she was looking at. "A gift from Mr. Malenkov," he said. "He likes you." "I'll bet," Sarah replied quietly. She remembered what he'd said to her as she'd left. If they had bad luck, they wouldn't be around to buy more weapons. He was expecting a repeat purchase. With any luck, they wouldn't need to. If they couldn't stop Skynet and Kaliba with all this then, there was just no stopping them at all. "It's all here," Sarah called out to Ellison. The former agent came up and whistled at the sight of all the weapons in front of them. The four of them quickly and carefully transferred the weapons from the back of the van to the Mercedes trunk, which was so full by the time they'd finished that the rear suspension was weighed down slightly. Ellison handed over the envelope, and one of the heavies counted the cash, whilst the other held his pistol at his side. "It's all here," he concluded after taking a few moments to double-check it. The two men turned round without another word and got into their van. Seconds later, it grumbled to life and pulled away, disappearing in the dark and the rain once more, as if it had never been there. A very wet Sarah and Ellison returned back to the Mercedes and got inside. "That went well," Sarah said, surprised. "You should have more faith." "Faith isn't part of my programming." Sarah deliberately echoed Cameron's words to her long ago, a slight smile on her face despite herself. Ellison caught it and looked at her. "What's so funny?" he asked. "It's something Cameron said once. That faith wasn't part of her programming. I think it's the one thing we had in common." "Other than John," Ellison supplied. Sarah nodded wistfully. "Other than that." She started the engine and pulled off, leaving the alleyway and heading back onto the main road. She kept her speed steady. The last thing in the world they wanted was to be stopped by the police with a trunk full of military-grade weaponry. Sarah drove on through the quiet roads and patiently navigated the city, keeping her eyes peeled for any police cars around. She flicked her eyes up to look in the rear-view mirror every few seconds and took note of every car behind her. Sarah turned right at the next intersection, and she noticed a gray SUV a few cars behind them. It followed them right, and Sarah's lips pursed in anticipation. Was this another tale? Were Kaliba onto them again? She turned right again and watched in the mirror as the SUV continued on its way. Either it wasn't following them, or the driver had caught her counter-surveillance trick and had pulled away, radioing their position and direction for another team to follow. She carried on turning right until she'd gone a full turn around the block. She didn't see any cars that stood out behind them. She carried on her way, occasionally pulled more counter-surveillance tricks to throw off any followers, until she reached her destination. She pulled up outside the same church where she and John had asked for sanctuary and hidden from Cameron, stepped outside the car and up to the entrance, once again ignoring the pouring rain. They stepped inside, and Sarah saw Father Benilla clearing up, preparing to leave for the night. He saw her, and his eyes narrowed for a moment, until he saw past the blonde hair and glasses, and recognized her. He stared at her in shock. "You," he said, still in disbelief. "I never thought I would see you again. The police and FBI are looking for you." "I know," she said, a slight hint of apology in her voice. "I explained to you what I'm trying to stop. I need your help one more time." Benilla smiled sadly but shook his head at her. "If what you told me is true, then I wish you luck. I'll pray to God to keep you safe, but this is not my fight. I have no more money to give you. I have nothing else." "It's true," Ellison stepped forward. "I've seen it with my own eyes. Everything she told you is true." He fingered his own cross. "I'm a man of faith too, Father. I've seen and done things I never thought I would, because of all this. So have you. You know it's all real." Benilla had never actually seen a Terminator, as far as Ellison knew. And he had no idea what Sarah was even thinking. She hadn't filled him in on this part or any other of her plan, assuming, of course, she even had one. Part of him thought she was playing it by ear, but he'd stick with her. He indeed was a man of faith, and he was placing all of said belief in Sarah. "I told you about my daughter," Sarah said. "The girl who broke you out of prison. Yes." Sarah looked down at the ground, her eyes downtrodden. "She died breaking me out. I need to bury her." Benilla breathed out a sigh of relief. He was afraid she would ask him to become more involved with what she was doing, and was glad that wasn't the case again. Then he felt a sudden surge of guilt that he'd felt relief at the news of her child's death. Very unchristian, he chided himself. "I am sorry," he said to Sarah, genuine sadness in his eyes. The death of a child was always the most tragic. The fact her daughter was caught up in their struggle made it even more so. He'd had to console several families in the area who'd lost loved ones around her age, serving in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it never grew easier. "How did she die?" he asked. "She was shot. She bled out after we'd gotten away." "Father, we need to bury her. Can you help me with that?" "I can give you the number of a funeral parlor. They will—" "I can't," Sarah said firmly. "I told you there are people out there who want this world to burn. They're looking for me. So are the FBI and the police. If any of them find me, then everything I told you Judgment Day, the machines, the end of the world will happen. I can't take the risk. I need you to do it." "And her body?" Benilla asked. "We've got her," Ellison replied. Benilla looked at her, surprised and a little disturbed that they'd kept her dead daughter's body at home. She needed to be laid to rest. "She's one of them," Sarah told him. "A machine. Why do you wish to bury a machine?" Benilla asked. "She was like a daughter to me. And if anyone gets their hands on her, the world could end a lot sooner." Sarah knew they couldn't keep Cameron's body in Ellison's house indefinitely. It wasn't safe out of their sight, and they couldn't very well drag her with them everywhere they went. They had to keep her hidden, and the best place for that was 6 feet under. "We'll pay you." Sarah pulled out a small wad of notes. Benilla shook his head at her and pushed her hand away gently. "I don't need the money." He paused to look at her and Ellison. "I'll help you, but this will be the last time." He wrote the church phone number down on a sliver of paper and handed it to Sarah. "Call me tomorrow, and I'll have something arranged for you.